heard earlier from both Captain Moak and Paul Rinaldi about the benefits that have already been incrementally implemented across the country, ERAM to a certain extent, some PBN, some RNAV, but what are the issues and how do we keep those moving along? And have we really realized the full value of the investment to date? What has worked, what can be done better, and that sort of thing. And we'll also take a look at this from a business standpoint with Alan over on the far left there. And with that, my name is Steve Hansen, the NACA Safety Chair, and been a controller for about 24 years. To add on to what Trish said about the cats, we can teach cats how to bark, but we can't teach dogs how to meow. So just if there was a question about that, I know there were 10 in the queue from the previous one, and I was wondering if that one was it. But to my immediate left, Dale Wright, Director of Safety and Technology for National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and to his left, First Officer Marc Henegar, Air Traffic Services Group Chair for Airline Pilots Association International. And to Marc's left is Steve Dickson, Captain Steve Dickson, Senior Vice President, Flight Operations, Delta Airlines. And to the far left, Mr. Alan Hockenbury, Director at Deloitte and Touche. To get started, just to kick off this, we'll go with introductions, and each one of them will do a little bit of a presentation or an introduction and about what they're all about and what they represent, and we'll start with Dale.
Thank you very much. As NACA's Director of Safety and Technology in the last 5 years, 6 years since 2007, with NextGEN and our involvement, we've grown from myself and one retired controller in the office and one admin to, we still have the same admin, 4 retired controllers on staff now, in addition to myself. And we have about 300 controllers working on various projects, and those are NextGEN and other related things. As NACA moves forward, the benefits we've seen from NextGEN aren't just ELSO, as Paul mentioned. That's the equivalent lateral spacing operations. I keep an eye on that one because I am, as we call, a former legacy controller in Atlanta, and I can remember when we had the 4 runways, how many planes we could work an hour. And even with ELSO, when you go to 2 runways using ELSO in Atlanta, you get 128 departures an hour, which is about 28 to 33 more than we got back when we thought we could possibly, there was no way possible to get more departures off that airport. So that's a substantial benefit. But NACA's also benefited from the research of NextGEN. Projects like, we didn't even agree with the project Staff NextGEN Towers or remote towers, but did we turn around and go elsewhere? No, we went in and worked with that project. And we're using some of the benefits realized from the Staff NextGEN Tower initiative to put out in the field now for the controllers to use, and also with some of the new initiatives like remote towers, blended airspace, things like that. So some of the benefits that we've realized as an organization, industry hasn't seen it yet, but we are getting benefits from the research. Greener skies, you've heard that mentioned several times. Greener skies we've learned a lot of things about what we need to do as far as coordination. Also, as mentioned before by the question Marc asked earlier, maybe we've put too many points on them and we need to reduce those points out and reduce the restrictions. Regional jet involvement is also an issue that we've seen some benefits in that, but we have a long way to go with the airplanes. We've also, as we move forward, things like Datacom, we're kind of like the second generation here of Datacom now. We're going back into it. We have a national representative for that, OAPM, that's part of NextGEN. And of course, the foundation of NextGEN is ERAM. We've seen the benefits from that. We've learned a lot of lessons that's used on other projects from what's happened in ERAM. We try to take those lessons that we learn and make the other projects like TAMR, Datacom, we try to make it smoother, try to make it go, we say quicker, but not to overlook things, but to not hit the bumps in the road. And as we move forward, I think we'll get more benefits out of NextGEN, like we've noticed in Chicago. When you run, Chicago's departing to the south, and you've got arrivals going to 1-3 center at Midway. If you run the the approach in there, the next-gen type approach, if you want to call it, you can still run departures off O'Hare, but as soon as somebody comes in that's not equipped, you have to stop the departure off O'Hare. So that's a benefit that we're seeing today. And as we move forward, hopefully we can deconflict other airports, such as New York. Let's face it, new runway is not an option there. So we need to learn how to use the airspace better. If we can deconflict Teterboro and Newark from JFK, the users and the traveling public will see a great benefit in that. And so that's what we've seen so far at NACA.
All right, thanks, Dale. Next, Marc Henegar.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to start by telling you a little bit of a story. So I'm Marc Henegar. I fly in the future. I live in a world where I don't start engines until I'm ready to taxi and depart without delay. I usually fly direct from a gateway fix at my destination to a gateway fix at my from my gateway fix at my origin to my destination. When I do fly on airways, they're less than a mile wide, and I'm procedurally separated from other traffic. And the airway center lines are maybe a few miles apart. I use required time of arrival and other tools to assist air traffic control in achieving their spacing objectives. I have lateral and vertical guidance to every runway end in America and Category 2 and 3 minima to the airports that need it. Most of the air traffic control I get is from its clearances to tactical reroutes is via text messaging. AIS and meteorological flight planning and management information is provided real time through visual displays. That's what NextGen means to me. That's what NextGen, I think, would mean to a pilot. And that's what we look for. And so now we're here to talk today about, are we getting our money's worth? Well, let's take a walk through the recent past. And I also want to point out that per FAA guidelines, I have my NextGen and my paper backup right here. So when I was a controller, those lone years ago, and I would point out if I was still a controller, I wouldn't be here because I'd be retired now, but that's a whole other question. When I was a controller working on some of those late shifts, if there were no airplanes, which would happen, I would occasionally read riveting FAA material like the radio air navigation plan. And after I finished that, I was so excited I'd read past radio air navigation plans. And I noticed more often than not, the programs and the descriptions were exactly the same. The only thing that changed from year to year was the timeline kept moving to the right off the page. And I thought that was very interesting, and that was my first exposure to what we might consider NextGen. MLS comes to mind when we talk about those programs. When I worked at a GPS manufacturer in the mid-1990s, loss and WAS were foregone conclusions. It was the future. It was the immediate future. And here we are 2 decades later. WAS, yes, it has worked. It's been a great success. Loss, we're still kind of at a loss for loss, differential GPS, GLS, GBAS, or whatever we're going to call it. And that saddens me, because I think of this almost 2 decades ago. We were talking this talk. In the meantime, during all these years, R&P sprouted out of Steve Fulton's garage, and folks like Bill Air and others at Alaska Airlines had the vision to invest in its potential and have been rewarded many times over. Savings of over $20 million in a year between saves and increased lift on the airplane, over 200,000 gallons of fuel saved. Okay, that sounds like the NextGen I was thinking of. But how is Alaska's success, for example, translated to the NAS? Well, in 2011, Alaska flew 12,776 R&P approaches and departures. 12,648 of those were designed by Alaska Airlines. 128 of those, or 1%, were on FAA-designed R&P SAR procedures. Of the 1,545 saves that Alaska recorded, a save being a flight that would have been canceled, diverted, something else bad going on, of those 1,545 saves, 16 were on FAA-designed R&P SAR procedures. That's 1%. George Orwell's 1984 has come and gone, at least I think it has. 2001: A Space Odyssey wasn't so much, and even Steve Jobs has died. What's left? So how do we get there? Well, as Lee Moak talked about, as Chuck Hogeman talked about earlier, it has to be a collaborative environment. What are we missing? We got to find common points for collaboration, discussion, and partnership. You know, that's professional pilots, it's air traffic controllers, it's stakeholders. We have to help define the capabilities to ensure that safety is key, a part of NextGen. And then, importantly, success requires commitment by all. It's gate-to-gate NextGen. It's everyone. FAA operators must see an achievable near-term ROI. That's not 10 years from now, a few $1,000,000 on a cool brochure. That's near-term. That's in a month or just a few years to make it worthwhile. We have to move, we've talked about this a little bit, the lowest common denominator. We've got to move the bar up, not down. Got to move from the lowest common denominator to the best equipped, best served, best capable, best served as a means to provide incentive and ROI for NextGen bleeding edge early adopters. We have to give credit for aircraft performance for separation purposes in the terminal area and en route. Mixed equipage limits the separation benefits we can gain. Aircraft performance differences prevent closer ops for departure and arrival corridors. As the equipage gets better, the system gets better. Nothing can be developed in a vacuum. The FMS has to be developed to fly the way we need to fly. FMSs have to fly similarly so that the aircraft performance is dependable and repeatable. We have to move the bar up and not down with the equipage issue. One thing we've noticed at Greener Skies in Seattle, it's been a good success. If you wanted to have that conversation about greener skies 10 years ago, you couldn't get anybody to listen. The environmental movement has, in a lot of ways, been NextGen's best friend. Because of that green movement, now things like Seattle's Greener Skies get a lot of media, gets a lot of attention, gets a lot of support. But some of the issues we're seeing now in Greener Skies, beyond the talk about fixes, restrictions, are flyability. The recent issues we just had that were worked out in a meeting last week were not about necessarily mixed equipage. It was identically equipped airplanes, but the difference in how one airline flies a procedure versus how another airline flies a procedure, which basically meant that it was flyable for one, not flyable for another. So we've got a lot of moving parts here, a lot of variables. The last point I would make is that when we get NextGen, there's more to NextGen than just up here. We're going to get to a point where we need more runways, taxiways, ground infrastructure. Otherwise, all we're doing is moving our delays downstream. So I want to thank you for your attention. Look forward to your questions. Steve.
Well, thanks, guys. And I want to thank ALPA and NATCA for putting this conference on. You know, I think the operator perspective, or the end user perspective, as has been used earlier, is really critical. And you know, the folks who are involved in executing the operation on a day-to-day basis, it's difficult for us to pull our heads out of the foxhole sometimes and really take a look at what the kind of decisions that we need to make, not only to improve today's operation, but continue to move it forward with the kind of timelines that we want to put in place. So it's really the transition that's difficult. You know, we've been doing, you know, as Marc said, we've been doing performance-based navigation, R&P procedures into mountainous airports for access purposes and operational reliability for well over a decade. The problem is scaling those operations to complex airspace without losing capacity. It's Chuck Hogan mentioned it earlier. You know, it's like rebuilding the beltway. You know, but you've got to keep current traffic flows working during the construction project. When you take these kinds of operations and do them and implement them in a place like you know, the New York airspace, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, various places that we've come to refer to in recent times as the Metroplex locations, doing that and putting the tools in place to be able to continue to run a reliable operation is where the difficulty is. But there are a lot of successes we can point to. We've talked about some of them. Nothing's, you know, there's a lot of frustration. Nothing's moving as quickly, or the whole system is not moving as quickly in terms of benefits as many of us would like. But again, you know, we have seen, I think, a paradigm shift on the aircraft equipage issue. Because of the fact that there's been a more stable industry here in the last 4 or 5 years in the U.S., airline balance sheets have been cleaned up to some degree, and that trend is continuing. And what that's allowed us to do, not necessarily for reasons related to aircraft navigational or communications or CNS performance, but for a product for our customers, there's a lot of fleet renewal going on. And there's also a lot of upgauging going on that's even bringing new regional aircraft into the regional fleet as well. A lot of that's being driven by something that's been a headwind for the industry to overcome. It's increasing fuel prices, but that's led to an upgauging in airlines. I know at Delta, over the next 3 or 4 years, we will be upgauging our average fleet size, if you look at our consolidated fleet, by about 15 to 17 seats. So what that's doing is it's giving us a little bit of a honeymoon period in a sense, where we're increasing capacity in the system gradually from an available seat miles perspective, but we have fewer operations in the sky. But eventually, that slack will get taken up, and so we need to keep everything moving forward. Some of I go back, if I look at the busiest airport in the world in Atlanta, the one I'm most familiar with, some of the things that were pioneered in Atlanta, the RNAV departures, are paying dividends to all operators in and out of the airspace of in excess of $30 million a year. And that was a capability that was implemented back in 2006. Atlanta and Dallas-Fort Worth were the first 2 locations in the NAS for consistent RNAV off the ground. And at first, it was a little bit of a struggle. We had procedural struggles with, how are takeoff clearances going to be given? How are we going to verify the first waypoint? Is something going to be called a pilot deviation or a controller operational error? And we worked together and we were able to overcome all of those things. Now, that tool is something that I think the approach control, the departure control would have we'd have an uprising if we tried to take that tool away from the controllers, and the pilots feel exactly the same way. And certainly from an airline perspective, we see the benefits, and now we've matured that capability and added equivalent lateral separation operations so that we can essentially get 3 runways worth of departure throughput out of 2 pieces of concrete. Right now, that's only being done in Atlanta, but it will be scaled to probably another 18 to 20 locations where it will provide benefit within the next couple of years at other locations around the NAS. So that, again, that's really an enabler. But we are in the execution phase. Planning certainly continues. There are some challenges in some areas, I think, particularly associated with Datacom, some decisions that have to be made in terms of standard setting and services that need to be provided. I think that a lot of the discussion has been on, aircraft equipage and the coordination between the airplane and the controller. We can't forget about the airline ops centers and the command center and all the ground decision support that has to be put in place, because we still have to have a coordinated system. I actually think that that's where we're going to start to see a lot of the benefit will really ramp up in the years when we have a more integrated system, and that's really what we need to be working for. As part of this transition, I really see that we need to focus on 5 areas. We need to increase operational implementations. 2 of the biggest recommendations, the most significant recommendations that came out of the Task Force 5 effort a few years ago were to focus on local implementations, metroplexes, and also the emphasis on airport surface operations. And there's a number of projects around that have really provided some outstanding benefits there, and I've just talked about one of them, but we're seeing similar developments in places like Houston, in New York, and other locations around the NAS. We've got to leverage the technology that's out there, build a little, test a little as we go along. Achieve benefits by working together. I talked about RNAV departures and ELSO. We've also got the Southern California OPDs. We've got some new departure procedures out of LaGuardia that are in the process of being implemented. We've had some community reaction to that we've got to overcome. But and we've moved the airspace between LaGuardia and Kennedy by a half mile to try to deconflict those airports from each other to some degree. That's because we're taking better advantage of the performance capabilities of the aircraft. We've also got to help the FAA and continue to stay engaged as the user community to develop the supporting policies, procedures, criteria, and training that are necessary to support the improvements in the operation. And we've talked a little bit about best equipped, best served, and I think we've actually moved a little bit beyond that because, as we all know, there are multiple ways to achieve a given capability. So we've actually come to think of it more as best capable, best served. I just actually checked out on the Airbus after flying Boeing equipment for 20 years, and I can tell you that the Airbus achieves a capability a little bit differently than a Boeing does. And so there are certain base standards that need to be set, but there are going to have to be both on the ground and in the air procedures and policies put in place to be able to deal with some of those technical differences. And finally, we need to be able to collaborate and work together. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how do we engage our different parts of the community in terms of stakeholders. I think that we all see each other in some of these different panels around Washington, and we have our outreach, within our various stakeholders within the industry. But the traveling public that really should be the biggest advocate for NextGen doesn't really understand what it is. It's not something like an interstate highway or a bridge that they can look and touch and feel, and that they're actually going to drive on themselves. And Beth White, who is here, gave a really outstanding presentation to the NextGen Advisory Committee working subcommittee yesterday that really focused on how do we develop around the country this kind of grassroots level of support. Because if you think about it, the business community and the important role that airlines and aviation in general play in our economy is not well understood by folks outside of this room and outside of Congress and in the companies and the organizations that we work with. So I think that's a charge that we should all take as we move forward to try to work together to tell the story more effectively. And I think that's where we'll be able to really get some traction at the local level around the country.
Go ahead, Niall. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to give some perspectives from some of the things that we've done with the study and just some other perspectives. Interesting, all the folks to my right here are definitely heavy hitter aviation types, so I'll give a little bit of a personal introduction just so you can believe that even someone from an accounting firm can have some level of aviation quals in their background. So I'm with Deloitte, been there 7 years. I head up our transportation practice, but coming out of high school, I went into the Air Force. I did 4 years as a A&P mechanic working on F-4s and F-16, so I do have some aviation. But from there, I was fortunate enough to go into the NASA programs where I was heavy into system engineering for space station, space shuttle, and a lot of their X programs. And I think what that's given me and an ability to even contribute in this setting is I've worked quite a number of high-risk, highly complicated programs, so I get what it takes. I've been involved and been part of failures and successes. I mean, it's just the nature of these kind of programs. So, and one of the reasons we were asked to sort of sit in on the panel is back in May of 2011, we did a study. And it was interesting, when we first took on the study, we had this concept, and maybe foolish at the time, that what if we could do this 5 years early, and what would be the business case? And that's kind of where we started. And then I was pulled in a little bit later into the study, and I said, guys, we need a pragmatic view here, you know. So we stepped back and we said, okay, let's come up with 5 years early, on time, and 5 years late. And so it delayed the study, but in the end, you know, the studies just got tons of data and things like that. But I tried to get the front load part of this to really tell the story of, look, the business case is just solid at a holistic top level view. I think one of the shortcomings probably of the study that I would say is I wish we were able to do a deep dive at looking at each of the individual systems and looking at the building blocks and the interdependencies as that business case builds, because it could even help make some decisions on what's really the best roadmap. But that's, you know, if you're paying for it on your own nickel, you sort of draw a line. But in the end, the business case was solidly there. I think the question we really came to is, it's not, is this worth doing? It's how are we going to do it? How are we going to get past just some of what seemed like some very difficult challenges and problems? And, you know, when you look at it, you know, right now we have one of the most safe national airspace systems around, but it's done on the backs of our aviation professionals. And, you know, to me, I can't help but feel, when you look at some of the technology and all the other industries and businesses and how much they're evolving, we owe those professionals the highest level of technology to have the most precise, safest, whatever. And I think that's one of the things that we walked away with. You know, I want to be a little careful commenting on progress, because when I look at a system by system, you know, I'm not as close to it, and I don't want to, you know, sort of misspeak, but I do step back and say some of what I've seen, particularly from a business or a programmatics perspective, on the FAA side, I think they've made some great moves to do some reorganization, to create a PMO strategy, trying to improve some of the governance so they have better oversight of some of these programs. That's a move in the right direction. A little concerned about they're in a state of maybe change saturation. There's so much going on in the back office and the front office. It's something I think that just needs to be watched, and we've got to handle that carefully, because that in itself could contribute to slowing down or having some difficulties with the program. When you look at two of the bigger programs, ADSB and ERAM, I mean, the infrastructure side, that seems to be moving on quite nicely. It's probably the equipment side that there's going to be a question. And I don't know if that's so much a technical issue, but a confidence level of when do we want to start doing it. ERAM recovery, I think that actually proved to be, and this really gets to my fourth of these points, one of the most significant elements of progress, I would say. And it's a shame you end up doing it sort of at a high cost, but it's been a deep learning experience that we've had to date with the NextGEN program. And ERAM's a perfect example where we failed to bring in the full stakeholder community into that development from the very beginning, cradle to grave. You know, I spent 14 years in NASA, and there was never a software control board or any form of a formal board or requirements development or a verification and testing that you didn't have astronauts in the loop, controllers in the loop. All those folks were in there. They were the major decision makers, and they got to sign off. And I think that's where we've got to head with the NextGEN program. So talking a little bit about, okay, we agree this is definitely, it's a program we must do, but how do we get there? What are some of the major impediments to success? One, I know there's a later topic on this, and that's the funding topic. And I think this is just hugely important. And I think it's got to almost step back a bit and really start to understand what really are the issues with funding. Because on one level, there's a lot of effort around incentivized financing and how that might help improve the equipage. And I'm not even entirely convinced that that's a money issue so much as a timing issue based on confidence, when I think I should or when does it make business sense to me. So I think that's got to be handled in its own way. The other is the sustained funding. Sequestration is going to cause its own issues. There's no doubt about it. But when you start looking at the budgets that are coming out now and the disparity between the Senate and the House, that will make sequestration, I mean, it's going to be a problem. There was an earlier discussion, I thought it was a great one, the analogy about the freight train. This freight train gets moving, it slows down, then it gets moving, it slows down. Then you have a year where now we're way out of kilter between the Senate and the House, and we're talking $7+ billion difference. I don't know how you reconcile that. The concern you start to run into there is now you're really going to start holding that freight train back. And there was the discussion earlier from ICAO, and I start to wonder, how do you even keep the synchronization of harmonization? I mean, we're starting to pull back and slow down. What's their momentum? And so the range of problems technically that fall out of us not figuring out the funding, I think, there's got to be a grassroots movement of something where we really try to solve this one. The other is the stakeholder confidence. You know, I constantly, or I hear this from time to time, and you know, one of the notions that I have is maybe part of it is FAA thinking about some concepts around a much more formalized system engineering based governance strategy. I think the current strategy is a pull strategy. It's basically where FAA is trying to pull from the programs and get a sense of how you're doing, how things are going, versus a push strategy and embed within these programs some way that they can really get an independent, honest to goodness understanding and serve as an independent community. I think it's worth some serious consideration. There's a cost to that, but I think if you look at major DoD and NASA programs, the return is much greater and it will offset the cost and really hope to minimize slips, cost overruns, and things like that. A fourth move ahead for me would be, even though the business case, we holistically believe it's there, is it worth doing a bit more of a deep dive around the business case on some of the future systems and really understanding each one of those and how they tick and tie back and forth to each other and the right building mechanism of what's the roadmap forward. And then the closing one for me, and it's interesting, the congressman sort of hit on this too, you know, where's the hype? For some reason, this is such an amazing program to me, and I just don't see the hype. It's got the potential of creating lots of jobs across lots of call the color, whatever it is, blue collar, white collar, whatever. And I don't see us engaging our young people to pull them back into the aviation industry. Environmentalists, why wouldn't they be all over it? Look what they're going to see out of it. And then the economics. It's hard to argue the economics for the business people and for the non-business. So I think a hard campaign that targets the 3 to 5 major sectors that will benefit from this, whether it's things in the airports, whether it's commercials, but I think it deserves that kind of attention to help also push the political pressure that this is a no-brainer for us as a country.
Thanks, Alan. So before we go to Q&As from the audience, I think we have quite a few from the texts too. So we want to thank, for those that didn't know, we're also webcasting, and we wanted to thank those watching on webcast for all their questions that are coming in via text. And just one question before we go to all those Q&As from me to the panelists is, it's pretty clear that there have been some tangible benefits and everything, but from a user's perspective, and I would ask Alan to weigh in at the end for his perspective as well, but from the user's perspective, what has worked well and what has the front-end controllers, pilots, company, how does that help your confidence in the system and how has that made it work, I guess? And we'll start with Dale.
Thank you. Well, what's worked well for us is we started out kind of rough at the first. We didn't have the people, but as we have the people, we have learned how to do work groups better and how to include people. And we've learned what we need to put, what type of controller do we need for these PBNs. And we've also learned that, we don't design for pilots, so they need to be there too. So one of the best things we've done is that I feel from where I sit is that when we establish a team, just like in Greener Skies, we had a meeting last week on Greener Skies. We sat down internally, discussed what do we need to make sure that we're there. The pilots knew where we were, the airlines were there. We sent a team out there, not just one person. We sent a team that way. If there's questions for different parts, we had the people there. And what we've learned the best is you have to have a complete team and include everybody. And you have to deep dive internally first. You just don't go from meeting to meeting and make up things as you go. You study it, you discuss it, It does take a lot of time, but we have learned to be more thorough, and that's one of the best benefits internally that we have at NACA.
Thanks. Mark?
Wait a minute, Dale, you don't design everything for pilots?
No.
Man,
Now,
my
if we could only
self-esteem
get
just,
you to understand that you're not a controller,
Yeah.
damn,
we'd be good.
my self-esteem is just taking a huge hit. You know, what I've heard said a couple times here, and Steve made a great point earlier, that when we try to tie this together, it seems like we've had a lot of beautiful local successes. Whether it's, you know, Alaska's R&P, whether it's maybe a greener skies, or the use of MLS and multilateration in Southeast Alaska. There's a lot of local successes and implementations that have been great. The problem we seem to have is a scalability issue. We take the little success here, we beta test it here, we roll it out to the world, and next thing you know, we're back at the drawing board again. I will say that FAA and stakeholders, we've gotten a lot better at how we do things. FAA is much more of an inclusive organization now. In the beginning, a lot of things were designed sort of in a vacuum, which doesn't work very well. And now there's a lot of folks invited to the table when we design these things. It's ALPA, it's other pilot organizations, it's AOPA, it's the airlines, it's NATCA, it's ATC management of facilities. So we got a lot of people, smart people in the room, and that's what I'm enjoying seeing now. But the problem, the hesitation I get is we seem to talk a lot, but we don't always seem to get a lot. And we're still in that kind of, we see some tangible results because, for example, like I said, greener skies 10 years ago, couldn't you get the time of day? But that environmental movement, green is the color of NextGen. Just like Ellen mentioned, green's the color of NextGen. Green's what gives it political clout. Green's what gives it funding. Green's what gives it, the environmental friendliness it has. All these kinds of things. So we've got a lot of things to look forward to, but my biggest fear is that you and I will be sitting here having roughly the same conversation 5 or 10 years from now. I mean, I go back to almost 20 years ago thinking loss and WASP were foregone conclusions and the world would be saved and we'd be on to world hunger the next day. And here we are, decades later, still having some of the same conversations. Slightly more optimistically, absolutely, but still having some of the same conversations.
I think one of the things that's worked well from my perspective, and I'll speak from Delta and then also from the kind of as a large East Coast operator, if you will, and Dale actually hit on the point. We started out very much in the collaborative mode. This goes back decades, collaborative mode with our local ATC facility, obviously including the individual controllers and NACA as well. And so the lessons that we learned during the early RNAV implementation, we had a very forward-leaning group, both on the airline side and on the controller side, that were able to work together to make those kinds of things a reality. The other, I think, thing that's worked well is, although it's the busiest airport in the world, Hartsfield-Jackson has certain advantages in terms of its basic design. And in fact, if you look at the runway layout and the kind of the ramp layout, you can see that the airport in Denver, really is the same layout as Hartsfield. They just have a lot more real estate. And so, a lot of airports that are being built in the last, 20 or 30 years have really kind of used that template of, the parallel runways and the center train through the spine. And it's a very efficient way to move airplanes in and out because you've got access to both sides of the airport from that centralized ramp structure. And what that's done is, although it is as I said, a very busy airport, we don't have a large secondary airport to deal with as Houston does and as O'Hare does in Chicago and obviously in New York. So we've been able to test out a lot of things in terms of, they're beyond demonstration projects. They're actually working in complex airspace. We still have the capacity issues. We've got to integrate. Our gate spacing is extremely tight. At Hartsfield, it's actually the constraint at the airport. Our gate spacing generally runs about 20 minutes between flights. So, you know, you have to be moving airplanes off the gate, and because the next one's coming in, and there's not a lot of real estate to park airplanes. So, you know, we've been able to bring all those pieces together in something that's been much more than a demonstration program, and it formed a template for working with the FAA both locally and in Washington, as we've had to get, you know, new rules written, for example. ELSO is an example, and the RNP established is another thing that we're working on for independent approaches as well. I think the other thing that's worked well for us, obviously Delta along with American and United, you know, 3 of the largest airlines in the world now, but we have a vested interest. We're the largest connecting carrier in the world, I think, by it. So we manufacture connections. That's our business. You know, we don't have the same kind of network that those other carriers do. And so the pace of the operation and making sure that things don't break is a very critical portion of our operational reliability. We're still the largest operator up and down the eastern seaboard. So pursuing solutions that will work for the system is very important to Delta Airlines. You know, we're all competitors in a sense, but as Bill Ayer says, you know, in these kinds of things, when we're trying to improve the safety of the system and the operational performance and the efficiency of the system, we all benefit. So, you know, I've never tried to pursue, and Delta's never tried to pursue, you know, 100% Delta solutions, because obviously, you know, 100% of nothing is not going to get you anywhere. Sometimes we have to make compromises. You know, not every airplane can fly its preferred trajectory. We know that. You know, you've got to design a system that will work for all the operators and all the stakeholders, including, you know, obviously the regional carriers, mainline, general aviation, business aviation, the controllers, you know, everyone who's involved in making the system run. And I think that template that we built from those early days has really served us well. And I think as I said before, the next step is to really continue to collaborate, but work more on the integration side of it, so that we get the maximum value of all the pieces that we've been able to put into place.
So I guess my response, definitely, it's probably more from a bigger picture, programmatic perspective, but I think one of the things is it's just interesting how the NextGen program has also almost pulled out or brought a recognition of some of the technologies and some of the other things that have always been there anyway, just have been underutilized. And maybe even a lot of the Metroplex activity, I mean, really, you know, some of that could have been done earlier. So, you know, and whether you want to put it under the NextGen umbrella or not, either way, we're gaining benefit from it finally. So it's good to see that. The other two I have, and I wouldn't say we're completely there yet, but it gets back to the point I was making earlier about getting the right stakeholders in this cradle to grave. I think for the early part, a lot of the challenges we had is not the right people were in the mix from cradle to grave, and I'm still not convinced it's entirely there yet, but it's definitely headed in the right direction, because ultimately the users are the ones that are going to have to live with this system. And I've worked too many programs where I've seen the failures start to show up when you get into the V&V, the verification validation stages. It's like you start bringing users into the testing. It's like, what is this? This does not fit my business model, what I'm trying to do. And then the last is I'm seeing more of a trend towards more of a business-driven model versus a technology-driven model. We're still not there yet either, but we've got to recognize that the technology is nothing more than the enabler here. And in the end, it's all got to be about the business. What's the business function we're trying to achieve? And then what's the right technology to fit that?
Let's give a round of applause to the panelists.